Okay, wonderful. I want to welcome everyone to the final installment of our influencer series Capitalism. And, you know, the star herself, Miss Shoma Roy.
No, but thank you. A very warm welcome to everyone. Thank you again for sharing your afternoon with us. And thank you to the Women's Athletic Club for hosting this 5-part series called The Influencer, which is about the influence of the colonized upon the empires that subjugated them. Our series started in February with the Spanish Empire, and both the Portuguese and the Spanish justified empire building by propagating Christianity. The Dutch Empire was indirectly about religion, since unfair Catholic taxation spurred on the need for autonomy for the creation of the Netherlands. The French Empire narrative changed the lens from religion to economic dominance. And it is economics, commerce more particularly, that was the impetus for England's colonization. The Nourishment Project is about joyous curiosity and being part of something much larger than ourselves. Here are some of the references that inform this presentation. This series, Influencer, endeavors to step back, to look at history from a wider angle so that the intricate web of connections between different cultures comes into focus. Hopefully, it gives us a broader, more nuanced, and ultimately a more vivid view of our globally linked heritage. Influence and legacy is incontrovertible. And so we investigate the influence of the colonized on the empires that subjugated them to perhaps extrapolate lessons that may be applied to our future. As mentioned earlier, the series had opened with the 16th century Spanish Empire. The Treaty of Tordesillas, which was a 15th century papal decree, approved and encouraged the conquest, colonization, and exploitation of non-Christian nations. It all fell under what's known as the doctrine of discovery, which gave European Christians legal right to discover all lands occupied by non-Christian people merely by stepping foot on it. Therefore, and painting now with a very broad brush, religion, the spread of Christianity, was a motivation for colonization for both the Portuguese and the Spanish Empire. With the Dutch, and to a large extent Catholic France, it is economy, trade that spurred colonization. Then, with the British, it was economic dominance coupled with that entitlement attitude, this attitude of might is right, that was the driver for expansion. The influence of the colonies on the subjugating empires surprises. So, for example, where would Durer's famous rhinoceros print be if the animal had not been shipped to the King of Portugal from a ruler in India as a diplomatic gift? Now, rhinoceros isn't native to Durer's Germany. And also, just for fun, I want to point again, rhinoceros does not have, the real creature doesn't have a dorsal horn. And Dürer had very cleverly added it to direct your gaze to his very signature right there, AD. An unexpected contribution of Spain's dominance in South America was the South American dance, as shown in the dance notations, the saraband. The dance spread to Italy and eventually to France. And initially it was deemed vulgar, and yet it evolved into a slow, stately court dance, and 18th century Baroque musicians began to incorporate the saraband as a stylized dance form into the suites of dance music, as is evidenced in the work of Baroque masters such as Handel and Bach. So colonization's influence on food abounds. Chilies are actually a Spanish colonial product. They come from South America. Indigenous to South America only originally. Can you imagine the regular dish, Chinese Szechuan chicken or Kung Pao chicken, without the dry red chili adornments? And I always assumed they were from China. They were not. Originally, they're from South America. Along with the Baroque dance and the saraband and the chilies, Europe received something equally delectable from Spanish Americas, which was the New Spain out of South America, as shown in the picture, it's telling you 1,000 words, right? Chocolates. First introduced as drinking chocolate to France by the Spanish Anne of Austria when she married the French Louis XIII. This very medicinal drink for the South America's Aztec royalty influenced European royalty. Chocolate encouraged the art of porcelain. So shown here are some marvelous illustrations of chocolate drinking cups. And the French chocolate pot was an elevation of the Spanish molnillo, which is a stick that was used to froth chocolate when twisted quickly between one's hands, because originally chocolate came in the form of a drink. Later, they figured out how to make chocolate bars. One example of India's influence on Europe is textiles. After Napoleon's defeat in Waterloo, some of his soldiers proposed their services to rulers in Persia and eventually came into the services of Indian kings. There were many kings in India. And this one particular, Jean-Francois Allard, had come to service for the Indian ruler Ranjit Singh. During Allard's visit to his homeland, France, he had brought with him Kashmir shawls. During those times, soldiers returning to France from the proverbial Orient often returned with luxurious textiles for their lovers, and Kashmiri Pashmina shawls are works of art. And one fan of them was Empress Josephine, shown here with a dress which has the Indian motif of booty, which eventually is known as paisley, named after the place in Scotland that started weaving these patterns on the jacquard looms. Empress Josephine's influence helped spread the popularity of shawls throughout Europe. She might be what we would now call an influencer. Imagine if she had an Instagram account. So the motivation for this series was really to better understand our current geopolitics and to perhaps, as mentioned before, extrapolate lessons learned from imperialism's history that may be applied to our current capitalism, which is the commercial markets of global dominance. For example, China has this massive infrastructure project called the Belt and Road Initiative. So the Chinese diaspora resulting from this multi-billion-dollar multinational enterprise, what happens in a few decades? What influence will the Chinese expatriate economic cloud have on China herself? These people who have been transformed by the beliefs and ideas of the countries in which they now reside, how will these foreign ideologies influence the future of China from within? I was very interested in discovering that. So ships are a good symbolism for the vehicle of colonization for the Portuguese, for the Spanish, all the way through to the initial British colonies. And as the colonial impetus transitioned from religion to economics, it was mercantilism that increased an empire's wealth through exports. So an empire's colonies could supply raw materials and resources to the mother country. And then these colonies themselves subsequently would become the export market for the finished product. So they got you coming and going. The French, Spanish, and Portuguese competed with the British for colonies under the belief that no great nation could exist and be self-sufficient without colonial resources, extraction methods. Because of this very heavy reliance on its colonies, empires often imposed restrictions on how its colonies could spend their money or distribute assets. The Atlantic Triangle trade, which moved goods and people between Africa, the Americas, and Europe, thrived during this period. It is an exemplar of mercantile capitalism in action. And initially, accumulated wealth was limited by the tight grasp of the ruling monarchies and the aristocracies. But with the advent of the Industrial Revolution, that move, that growth by technology, significantly altered the means and relations of production. And these changes ushered in a new epoch, that of capitalism. The political economy that is the framework for today's presentation, titled Capitalism, pivots under the definition associated with the Scottish philosopher Adam Smith, which explores fundamental themes such as money, production, the mechanism of the free market, trade between countries, and the division of labor, all of it affects free market enterprise. In his book, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nation, known simply as The Wealth of Nation, Adam Smith stated that the self-interest through economic choices will be, and I quote, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his or her original intentions. Close quotes. He assumed that an economy can work well in a free market scenario where everyone will work for his or her own interest. That an economy will comparatively work and function well if the government will leave people alone to buy and sell freely among themselves. In a free market scenario where there are no rules or restrictions imposed by the government, if someone charges less, the customer will buy from that vendor. Therefore, you have to lower your price if you're the vendor or offer something better than your competitor. Whenever enough people demand something, it will be supplied by the market, and that, to Adam Smith, everyone will be happy. The seller ends up getting the better price, and the buyer will get better goods at the desired price. Free market, that is competition for that free market, is the invisible hand behind this equilibrium that he speaks of. The production boom created after World War II fostered a period of economic growth and accumulation for US corporations that set the United States on course to be the global economic powerhouse. This rise to power was fueled by technological innovations such as TV and radio that allowed for mass media advertisement to create demand for consumer goods. Advertisers began to sell a lifestyle that could be achieved through consumption of goods, which marks an important turning point in the history of capitalism. It was the emergence of consumerism, consumption as a way of life. So Thomas Jefferson had declared that, again, quotes, money, not morality, is the principle of commercial nations, close quotes. What this presentation strives to demonstrate is that the invisible hand, the influence, is both money and morals, simply because business is based on trust. The simple act of depositing money in a bank is with the belief, the faith that it'll await you when you go to get it out. You have a faith in the system. Trust is essential to business. The morality of money is hidden under spreadsheet terms like cost-benefit analysis. An example of this marriage of morals and money are the witch trials. I'm sure some of you were confused. Why did I send a picture of witch trials for capitalism? By no means was I implying that capitalism is bad, not at all. So specifically, it was because the business of witch hunting that started in the 16th century in Germany, in France, and Europe, it was a business to a large extent. Along with indescribable grief, the family of the victim, the witch, and the witch wasn't always women. In Germany, majority of the witches, or I guess you would call them warlocks, were men. So the family was forced to foot the bill for the codified process of imprisonment, torture, coerced confession, and execution. So the family had to pay for the attorneys, they had to pay for the one who conducted the trial, money, they had to pay for the wood on which their loved one was burned, they had to pay money to the one who tortured their loved ones, money to the one who inspected court records. Everyone had to be paid by the family of the witch. The cost of lighter shackles for women was higher than the cost of the shackles for men. So all of it, witch hunting, was a self-sustaining major trade employing many people. I was amazed to learn that. Maybe amazed isn't the right word. I was surprised. After a bill had been paid, the property that remained was susceptible to seizure by kings, bishops, local noblemen, or in case of Spain, the Inquisition itself. And in Elizabethan England, where witchcraft had a life sentence, the possessions of the accused became property of the crown. It's really interesting how one becomes wealthy historically. In 17th century Massachusetts, The legislation demanded that those acquitted remain in jail until they paid off their cost of their unlawful imprisonment. Can you believe that? During Europe's most intolerable periods of witch hunting, outbursts and panic swept through villages and surrounding regions as confessions under the stress of pain quickly led to the naming of other supposed accomplices. What slowed all the devil's work wasn't the invisible hand of God. It was economics. I suppose to the devout, God works in mysterious way. He worked through money. In 1630, after the Holy Roman Emperor forbade the confiscation of property, witch prosecutions declined noticeably in some places. In Bamberg, Germany, which had seen an average about 100 executions every year between 1626 and 1629, once the Holy Roman Empire made grabbing the properties of the witch illegal, the number dropped from 100 a year to 24 that year in 1630. And the following year, no one was executed. The city of Cologne, that had from the outset prohibited the seizing of property, experienced the fewest executions of any region in Europe. So the curbing of profits, economics, affected the desire to make a killing. Such economic sanctions impoverished vested interests, and the zeal of the prosecutors burned out because they weren't profiting from it. Though scruples, morals, and religion is associated with witch hunting and witchcraft, I suppose, it was another invisible hand that governed. It was the invisible economic angle that helped end persecutions. And this invisible hand of capitalism, extremely influential, is of interest. And true to the saying from the children's book, The Little Prince, things that are essential are often invisible. For comparison, to see how far we've come, let's return to commerce in the British Empire. So the cotton industry of India was transformed by the British. Charming as this painting may be, it actually serves a very economic message here. So I'm going to point now, please observe the carefully depicted sheerness of the fabrics worn by the Indian man. You can see parts of his sheer fabric shown here, and those that are draping the women depicted. That man who is seated has a tunic made of this transparent material. It's the same material that is adorning the women there. This material was known as muslin and was famed throughout India and often reserved for royalty. One interesting side detail about colonialism's effect in India. If you look at this picture of Chand Bibi, which was a very famous queen, Indian women during the time originally did not wear blouses. They went around bare-breasted. The body then was not looked upon in shame. So the early British women sometimes reveled in the freedom in private as captured in these paintings. Victorian Christian morality got imposed on a predominantly Hindu culture, and wearing blouses soon became the normalcy and remains so. Because isn't it interesting that those ancient Indian temple sculptures, the women never wore blouses. And it was because the blouse, ironically, it was that which sexualized the bodies. Before that, bare breasts weren't looked upon with scandal whatsoever. I just thought that was an interesting point I wanted to point out. Anyway, back to the concept of cloth and the muslin cloth. So the lost art of muslin weaving is one of, to me, one of the real losses due to colonization. I really don't care if some empire took jewelry, whatever. These are the things that matter to me deeply. The thread counts that are now being produced, because they're trying to bring back this craftsmanship, that thread count is nowhere close to what has been documented for muslin weaving during those times. The craftsmanship in India during colonization was deliberately priced out to allow for the flourishing of the cotton factories in England. This is how we have accumulation of capital. So to ensure the industrial factories in England were profitable, the trade lobbyists in England banned or made prohibitively expensive the import of chintz and calico cotton from India. The cotton, so before this, England made wealth out of wool, but it's not really comfortable to be wearing wool all the time. So cotton really makes it much more comfortable as everyday wear. That's why there was a demand for cotton, and to have it colored and beautiful like calico and chintz prints, who wouldn't want that? Well, the cotton textiles produced in England succeeded as the time-tested weaving in India was cunningly reduced by the invisible hands of colonial legislation, akin to subsidies nowadays. So this is all economically done. The British produced cotton cloth was then sold to the Indians in the subcontinent. So not only did it take away the production, so it's again affecting labor and production, they took that away and forced the only markets to come from exports from England. So now if you juxtapose that with the fabric and fashion of today, we realize improvements have been made. Decimating an entire way of life, human rights violation, is frowned upon now. So for example, probably the best example is the fashion brand Chloe. Their newly appointed in 2021, Chief Artistic Director, Gabriela Hearst, she's from Uruguay, is a long-time champion of environmental rights and transparency in the luxury supply chain. She is committed to a socially conscious business, and she was the first to make her fashion show carbon neutral. Many of her knitwear are made by female non-profit entities, and she uses often recycled cashmere. In fact, her own line of handbags have a longer waiting period than Hermes. It's really lovely. The invisible hand guiding her business model is again markets and morality, the moral obligation of creative leadership. Her products are carefully made, as environmentally and socially conscious as possible. They are also phenomenally expensive, in accordance to the old world belief that buy quality, pay up front, and it will last you a lifetime. So this is not anything to do with, throwaway monthly fashion. It is exact opposite of the profligate everyday fashion that dominates our markets nowadays. And this throwaway fashion is one of the worst polluters of the planet. But how do we even know of these things? It's because the markets respond to people. Despite her astronomical prices, Gabriela Hearst's products sell. People are willing to pay for quality because that's how one votes with our wallets. Individual influence is key. There are social enterprises, certified companies known as B corporations, that are interested in both shareholder and stakeholder success. So the brand Chloe is a B corporation, and entities like the brand Patagonia and the ice cream brand Ben & Jerry have been B Corps for a very long time. The B Corp designation demonstrates that a firm is following a different governance philosophy and redefining the way success is perceived in the modern world. So it's competitive success through a moral lens, via a differentiation in the fundamental purpose and legal form of an organization. So the more Chloe succeeds as a business, in sharp contrast to throwaway fashion, the more the free market will veer towards a long-term perspective. Success itself influences. These types of socially conscious economic choices are gaining widespread support in the financial sector. It comes under the umbrella term ESG, environmental social governance strategies. They are an instrument, they're an investment vehicle where people put their money to work in companies that have a positive net impact on environment and society, led by a management team that achieves these goals via better corporate governance. So along with financial targets, the fund managers for these investment firms review investments with the lens of an ESG philosophy. So for example, when they're reviewing, analyzing companies to invest in, questions will come up such as, what are the company's sustainability efforts in supply chain? Is the executive compensation balanced compared to the pay for the other employees? How does this company that we might invest in advocate for social good in the wider world beyond the limited sphere of business? This is how they review companies before they recommend investing in it. This investing for goals beyond monetary returns, however, without sacrificing performance, is being recognized even by traditionalists like Forbes. Here is a recommendation of the recommended ESG investment firms for this month of June 2022. Now, this is being included because just as in the witch trials, economic policies have a major influence in eradicating social ills. You know, when you took away the ability to possess the land from the deceased witch, persecutions dropped. One can use economic policies to address issues which plague us now: environmental pollution, discrimination policies. There are so many out there. And to conversely, to advocate for positive change. Trillion-dollar corporations, any of the Fortune 500 companies also, have massive influence on the countries they work in through their labor practices and by the things that they sell and how they use and affect the supply chain there. They can implement change in the countries where they do business. So, for example, prior to the 80s, the only car maker in India, practically the only one, was the Ambassador. It had no competition. It effectively ruled the roost. Almost 95%, probably more, of the cars in India back then, up to the 80s, were Ambassadors. The shape didn't change, and the only way one knew that you had a newer model was sometimes by the first few words of your letters on the license plate. But with the opening of the Indian markets to competition, to global competition, to cars coming in, the Indian roads are now snarled with traffic that never changed, and also potholes, I may point out. But there is a mechanical diversity in that chaos. I mean, I tried to look. I don't think I saw a single Ambassador in there. In fact, Ambassadors are almost vintage. They're probably a collector's item. They're awful. They're such an uncomfortable ride. So free market capitalism works. It is important, however, to view it in context of artificial intelligence. How free is the market when one enters Amazon Marketplace? And that is its official name, Marketplace. Is it the free market, the foundation of Adam Smith's capitalism ethos, where an individual is free to choose? Amazon isn't a marketplace, it is a platform. Just as you won't be given an option to buy a Lexus if you show up in a BMW showplace or a showroom. You may get it in their secondhand lot, but in the showroom itself, BMW is not going to showcase a Lexus. The Amazon Marketplace platform lets you choose from its own predetermined options. There is no free market going on here. Algorithms will also give you a variety of prices when you search, because they've been collecting data on you. It knows already what you're willing to pay or what you can be influenced to spend. You know, depending on where you log into these accounts, which IP address you're using, when you buy a ticket to a plane or whatever, even outside Amazon, all of this is affected. I don't know how any of this is really called free market. Truly, how free is this digital market? Consumers are influenced by markets, and is this invisible influence is very profitable, and it surrounds us. So whether it's essential or not is really up to the individual. So for example, Ancestry. In any of these sites, usually what it requires is you mail in a bit of a saliva or a piece of hair. And out of the nearly 3 billion base pairs in our DNA of the combination of the 4 letters, they will test to look for locations on the genome where people commonly vary from one another. Because it's looking, the algorithm, when I say it, I'm saying the algorithm is looking for a best fit, not a perfect match. That's why one may get a response like a 23% European profile when you submit your ancestry. Isn't that interesting? European profile. Europe is a rather vast geography. What really is it telling you when they say you have a 23% European background? Am I a Norwegian European or am I a Caucasian, from the Caucasus? They're all Europe if you define it. And moreover, DNA isn't heritage per se, is it? One inherits half the DNA from the mother and half from the father. So the mother and the father may not pass on all the inherited genes from your ancestors. Does that mean you're not related to the person because you only got half of their genes? An exact percentage of where our DNA comes from may not matter either, does it? So if your sibling inherits slightly more Scandinavian DNA than you, does that make your sibling more Scandinavian? No. Human history is a messy migratory affair. It's much too complicated to track simply using our DNA. We all know this. Yet, because there's a demand, again, voting with a wallet, this industry is booming and it's poised to grow even more. It's already here, consumer genetic skin treatment. They will look at your DNA profile and tell you this is what you should be doing. I mean, I was really, look at the aesthetics of that DNA logo. Personalized skincare treatment per your DNA. Okay. So the invisible hand of Adam Smith, wealth of the nation, may far outstrip his imagination in context of our digital market. Large corporations may be minting billions of dollars using your DNA with you being totally oblivious about it. Because once you submit your DNA, your saliva or your hair, that processing center, ancestry.com or heritage.com, whatever it is, most likely sells the stored DNA profile to pharmaceutical companies because it depends on where the company is. European corporations have much higher privacy policies than American ones. So they can sell your data to researchers, to companies, scientists, and other third parties to help them identify genes with diseases, to make improvements in drug treatments, and just in general enhance their research. Your data lines their pockets. Okay, fine, if it's going to help with the greater good of finding medicines, but parse further. What about the fact that humans share 99% of our DNA, and that's even more attenuated with siblings? So what if your sibling submits a DNA sample and the testing reveals a propensity or a precondition for a disease? That data will then be sold to an insurance company, which will alert them to these preconditions. This will affect the insurance rate both for your sibling and you. And how will they know it's you? Because we volunteer all this information on our social media, don't we? With LinkedIn, with Facebook, this is my sibling, this is my cousin. The AI, artificial intelligence, tracks all of this. And all this makes for interesting future financial decisions for you, even if you never, ever had your DNA analyzed. Isn't that something? I mean, there are many, many versions of this. All this is true because they're collecting data for money. It's really market driven. The aspect of financial influence that I'm very interested in sharing with you is philanthropic foundations. We are a very generous nation. Americans gave $471 billion to charity, to philanthropy organizations in 2020. Out of that, private foundations and even corporate foundations gave about 88 billion. In the United States, this money is largely unregulated and massively influential. Many of you are perhaps donors and might be using donor-advised funds, free market applications, and its influences may interest you greatly, or I really hope it does. I certainly don't want to waste your time. So here are the top 10 philanthropists in the past century. Since the number one person right here, Jamshedji Tata from India, and his successor, Ratan Tata, absolute gentleman. The Tata family's private business model for donation puts B corporations to shame. I think they give 60% or more of their earnings to charity. That's how the business operates, and they're running very successfully. Because rules in America are different from other parts of the world, we are going to simply talk about Western philanthropists, specifically American ones. Here are some of Chicago's prominent philanthropists. I don't know any of them. Perhaps you do. Historically, corporate philanthropic foundations were formed in the early 20th century. Upon the establishment of foundations like the Carnegie and the Rockefeller Foundations, there was fierce debate about their legality and lack of accountability. Observers worried that non-tax-paying entities with massive resources would be just another way for the wealthy to turn money into power. Even now, large organizations are deeply dependent on federal and foundation supports, and thereby tend to take a very soft line on economic and industrial reform. Directors of these corporations, of these foundations, are sensitive to the economic orthodoxies that lead to the formation of these foundations and are very careful not to do anything that might diminish the benefactor's endowment. Read between those lines. Influence of philanthropic foundations, however, can be nakedly political. So for example, I'm going to give examples from the back. So we have, a gap, a space. In the 1990s, in the Public Land Forestry Department, doesn't it make you wonder, why wasn't the program allowed to consider zero cut forestry position? If you're there to save forest, wouldn't the most obvious thing put a policy in there saying you cannot cut any tree? But it wasn't there. There's a reason why. But instead of getting into those nitty-gritty details, what I want to focus on is there was an enormous failure of misinterpretation, or perhaps a refusal to interpret. So I guess there wasn't a failure of misinterpretation, there was a failure of interpretation. So let's give an example how and why. This picture captures the ideal sense of giving, or it does for me. The humility of both the recipient and the giver, the donor. You will be hard pressed to tell who is receiving and who is giving. Nowadays, there's a foundation pattern that reveals the source where the misinterpretation of the ideas of philanthropy might come from. So in a big macro sense, usually there's a visionary who tackles a challenging issue. He or she finds a millionaire philanthropist who financially supports that vision to do good, to make improvements. And finally, the whole thing is handed off to bureaucrats who they reign in the world of data and the wisdom of bureaucracy. A pertinent example, again with a separation of distance and time, is instructive. Free market philanthropy. To get a better picture, we go to Afghanistan. The country's beautiful but ragged mountainous landscape ranges from towering blue mountains capped with snow in the central Hindu Kush regions to the green rolling hills in the north. If you go down now, red deserts of the barren red rock in the Helmand province and the sandy desert dunes across the south of the country. Nature abounds in Afghanistan. Even in the very profitable poppy fields that provide the majority of the world's heroin supply. This drug also provides the capital for many of the terrorists that are from that region. The US was aware of the problem when we were there, and please know there is no easy solution. Our interest today is in the agricultural economy, to view it through the filter of global philanthropy. The global philanthropy in this example is aid coming from the World Bank. So it was the World Bank that provided tractors to increase wheat production in Afghanistan. It's the interpretations, the measurement of success, the cost benefit that I had mentioned before, the morality of money, that is of deep interest to me. The influence of capital shows up here. Prior to the introduction of tractors in the tribal regions of eastern Afghanistan, tribal leaders converted economic surpluses into a social currency of patronage. So these leaders with the title Khan converted their own surplus, mostly agricultural wealth, into social relationships through hospitality, providing employment and other less clear-cut patronage for their fellow in their tribes. So the Khans, the leaders, would have social credit, and they operated by influence. And these natural communities transcended mere economic relations. With the advent of a tractor, previously barren lands that were seen as communal properties could now be cultivated to grow wheat. Ideas of wealth then didn't necessarily link to bank accounts because it wasn't really a cash economy. And the introduction of money, of cash, has huge influence, social influences. I'm going to skip through a lot of the details. I'm going to speed them up, but it is provided in the reference. It's fascinating reading, and the details really are important to muster and wrap our heads around. So in short, due to the quick turnaround of wheat, the land was overgrazed to grow wheat. Water was channeled to irrigate this land for a market-oriented regime of commercialized plowing. And this wheat was called lalmi. Before, they didn't grow this because they really monitored where the water was growing. They were growing fruits and melons and things like that, things that they need. Unexpected consequences emerged because of the introduction of the tractor. Previous to the tractor's efficiency, plowing land, these barren lands was used to grow wild scrub for sheep grazing, to have brush for heating and for cooking fires. All of that, which was free in these, communal land, now these were commodities that had to be paid for in cash, forcing more and more people into a cash economy for basic necessities that used to be free. Overworked lands aren't fertile and can cause devastations during low rainfall seasons. And furthermore, the introduction of tractors changed the structure of labor because you need less people to work when you have a tractor doing the work. And so social ties were ruptured. A tractor did the work of many, so you didn't have to keep in touch. But more than that, there is a dignity in work. A cash-based market economy accelerated the peasantization of the poor. There was dignity in being poor within that because one helped you out. Now you are valued by how much money do you have. The social connections that were based on redistribution and conversion of the surpluses by the Khans to develop social relationships, all of that, all of those bonds were torn. What happens to people who can't make a living? They move to the urban areas. Kinships were further lost. Hunger and lack of social structure make people prone to radicalization. And I ask you, are these people, disenfranchised people in Afghanistan, that different from those in the red states of America, people who feel deserted, left behind by a bewilderingly fast-paced world? I don't think so. And so in Afghanistan, because these are all instructive, they're just as an example, all this change in the social structure of Eastern Afghanistan was due to a good intention by philanthropic firms. Because from a desk on a paper, increased wheat production looks undeniably good because it's feeding more people. Here is where it becomes interesting, doesn't it? Depending on what is being measured, yield versus output of agricultural products, the noble intentions of any philanthropy have unexpected influence. So the free market's invisible hand has cost benefits that are misinterpreted. So if you're going to look at this and measure for money, because look what happened. One did grow wheat that one could sell and make money. More cash did come in. Free market reigned. All of this entire scenario I described to you showed positive cost benefit. Now, as a philanthropist, would you consider this a success? the morality of money, it's like, what are you measuring, has immense, massive influence. So with that in context, all these firms have philanthropic targets that they duly provide in their annual reports. The millions they invest, often with the best of intentions, that influence outstrips colonization, what colonization has done, simply because our world is so much more connected now. By voting with our wallets, by being conscious consumers through our own individual acts, we yield massive influence in the world. So if you donate to charity, thank you. The impact data that is provided by the foundations you support, please scrutinize what exactly is being measured. And perhaps should those measurement criteria be adjusted. But in the big picture, this series is about influence of the underdog, of the previously colonized, but applied to underdogs. Going forward, the sovereign debt of the countries that are involved in China's Belt and Road initiatives, because what China is doing is they're going to lend money to these countries so that they can pay China to develop the infrastructure there. So it's a financial setup. So the sovereign debt of the countries that are doing work with China, that debt will be leveraged for influence. It already is. Just as the witch trials were adjusted through economics, economic guardrails can be used to address current grievances. So for example, legislations like the financial transaction tax that makes it less profitable to do millisecond trade versus long run trade. All of this was put forth after the last financial meltdown, but it was not adopted. Now see, finance isn't evil. It's just that adjustment needs to be put in place to balance the effect of technology to the effect of artificial intelligence. It has massive ramifications. Business, capitalism, again, is based on trust. We are influenced, and it behooves us to recognize what is the true source of influence. So for that, ships, the symbol of mercantilism, that which preceded capitalism, is instructive. Please take a closer look at this very famous woodcut by the Japanese master Hokusai. It was part of his series, 36 Views of Mount Fuji. So I'm zoning in now. Notice the fishermen in the boat submitting to the awe-inspiring power of the wave, because they know better than to confront such a colossus. Because in life, when an energy of that level comes at you, be it a wave or anger, the best method is to submit, to go under, to let it wash over. As one sinks, one realizes the seeming peace, the stillness beneath the storm as one rides out the wave. Once settled in this supposed stillness, one realizes the imperceptible pull of the currents. So you realize you're not still, you're actually drifting. Sometimes that drift is very strong. So metaphorically, it's not the big things like career, marriage, life transitions, but the quiet immersions of family, the milieu you grew up in, the friends, these habits that have lasting influence, these constantly surrounding habits of us are the currents of life. If one goes deeper yet, one perceives this idea of stillness when you go really deep down. And in there, one gets introduced to the real influences, our individual beliefs that govern our individual lives. With those realizations, as one starts ascending, one realizes that aphorism, as below, so above. Wordlessly, because it transcends language. And it's senselessly, because in the fabric of our consciousness, in that deafening quiet, beyond the reaches of our technological hubris, beyond our desire to control, there reigns a lasting gravitational influence. I hope this series proved meaningful to you. Thank you for making the time to attend these presentations. And I'm really delighted to announce a new series starting in the fall. It is titled Opera and Inclusion. And it is really meant for those who currently don't attend operas, but yet it is designed to intrigue even the most die-hard opera fans. Whoever, if you're a fan of this art form, do come. And if you're just curious, come again. Over the 5 months, the series approaches opera through the lens of war and politics, religion, architecture and botany, love and lust, and finally, movies. Approaching opera, because opera is the most collaborative art form, we're not going to approach it through music. There's an abundance of classes that delve into coloratura and leitmotif and all these technical terms of music. This series is not going to be that at all. The presentation dates are aligned with the offerings from lyric opera, so that if you are to go to the operas that are coming up starting September, you will be more invested in the performance and know a bit more about each of these operas. So war and politics, the first presentation, is really, those subjects are Verdi's bread and butter. And since Ernani is the opening opera for lyric, it is included in the first presentation. And we really do approach opera with a sense of fun. So for example, the coronation anthem, Zadok the Priest, which is the coronation anthem for Queen Elizabeth, that was composed by Handel, which is an opera composer who composed the opera Rinaldo. And so similarly, it's like these odd facts that I hope you find fun. Like in terms of religion, did you ever guess that it is Buddhism that peppers a lot of the work of that non-controversial composer, Wagner? Architecture, this idea of build it and they will come. So this is La Fenice in Venice. And it'll stress, among other things, the importance of the sites, the opera houses itself, in promoting the popularity of opera, not just to be spellbound by the beauty of it. It served a purpose because operas were beneficial. They were financially good. Centuries ago, opera houses started popping up so that composers started to write operas. It was not surprising back then for a composer to write almost 40 operas because it was lucrative. In Love and Lust, for example, one learns of a priest who not only recognized desire, but admitted to it and submitted to love. Do you not want to know about this priest and what happened to the priest? And the music for the opera Thais is lovely. And saving the best for last, movies and TV. I love this one, but you also have operas and movies like The Pretty Woman. So what I want to get across is this is a very, very accessible series, and it's offered with love and reverence. It's called an inclusion, for it will include operas from India and China. This art form has been there for centuries, but the main reason for the inclusion is really about including you. You will be amazed if you've never been to an opera. Moments will capture you like no one else can. It is an addiction, it becomes one. And again, the global aspect matters to me deeply. The Chinese approach to opera is sublime. And I'm not talking about Peking opera. The way they approach opera in a very holistic way is really something we should really look into and perhaps bring into Western opera. So if this type of programming intrigues you, please go to our website, www.thenourishmentprojects.com, and perhaps consider signing up. $100 annual membership gets you access to every program that's ever given, and we give one almost every 2 weeks. So it gets you access to at least 20 presentations. I hope you find it valuable. This series is not offered through the WAC, so you will need to sign up to get access to this, and I really hope you consider it. But more than anything else, it has been a privilege and a pleasure to learn with you. And as always, I wish you joy. Thank you again for your time. I'm going to stop sharing now. Ta-da. All right. Are there any questions or feedbacks or comments? I welcome them.
Yes.
Oh, hi. Yes.
I sat through a good part of this analysis of capitalism, Shoma, and just some absolutely wonderful insights. But it all kind of came together when you talked about Afghanistan and the introduction of the tractor into the lives of these, I don't mean simple in terms of intellectually, but people
Farmers.
who live a relatively simple life. And there's no question that every invention, and if you look at our generation, the smartphone, 15 years old, has changed everybody's behavior in the world.
Yeah.
But you seem to
Cotton gin.
assign a value judgment to the way these people lived before. And if you would look at history and the history of capitalism that way, and judge capitalism by the way it changes society, and the implication, of course, there are negative aspects, but I mean, are you maintaining that we should go back to the world where because I think that it may be, if you look overall at this entire group in Afghanistan, maybe more people are happy now than were before, even with the breakdown of social connections and all the other things. So there's one big question mark in my mind with regard to what in that particular instance, and I think it's related to most of the other things that you talked about, what was the point that you were really trying to tell me?
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you for the question. And I want to say hi to Anne Hopcroft. Anna, I just saw you yesterday at the WAC, right? Nice to see you. Very nice to see you. It was nice to meet you. So to answer your question, first of all, I'm from India. It should be obvious. So our principle, and it is related to religion in this case, we have the Holy Trinity of what is the Christian Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost. We have these three principles of Kama, Moksha, Artha, and wealth is a principle of those three things. Wealth is looked on with reverence. I personally do not look at capitalism as a bad thing at all. I think money making matters because then you have an obligation to help, you have an ability to help. So I am a big proponent of being able to have money and then use it well to help others. And that's one of the reasons I included the man, one of the top philanthropists in the last 100 years, phenomenally wealthy family. More than 60% of their earnings goes to charity. There are many good things one can do. The only reason I included that aspect, one of the reasons I included that aspect of the Afghanistan story is to say that the ripple effects of philanthropy, mainly to show what you measure matters. If you're measuring, because that's what happens in 501c3 foundations. When you donate, you want some accountability, and they will give you an accountability on measures that they determine. Unless you know what is being measured and applying that to the context in the countries where you're trying to help, sometimes the story that comes out may not be the reality if you delve further. That was the only reason that was included in there. By no means should anyone get the impression that I think finance is bad, capitalism is bad. Absolutely not. Not at all. Did I answer your question, William?
Yeah, I think if I understand right, what you said is that there are unexpected consequences to things, but I think that's true of all of life. I mean, even currently, Russia went into the Ukraine with a certain mindset and what they thought was going to happen. And what has happened is the opposite. Without putting a value judgment on, for sure, every action causes something, the consequences of which we absolutely cannot predict with any accuracy. And in many ways, that's the essence of capitalism. things get tried
Mhm.
and used, and we see if it comes out, and society either adopts it or rejects it. And that to me is a very natural process. But yes, you did answer my question. Give myself for,
No,
you
no,
know,
no, no, no. You know, I think, again, I was trying to put it in context of the foundations that Adam Smith talked about, free market. He also said an educated populace, all of these, there really is an aspect of free market needs to be looked at when you talk about digital markets, digital transactions, and the philanthropy aspect of Afghanistan was also there because the foundation amounts of money are completely unregulated. How it's being spent, what it's being done, all of that, I was just trying to implicate, look at these things. This is not like petty cash voucher items. Almost $500 billion goes through US in philanthropy. It behooves us to look at it. I'm not saying regulated, but just have some measure, like, look what happens in here. You will make lasting changes in countries because of foundation money through philanthropy. It affects, issues of abortions in India and many other issues. Most of the time it does really good, but sometimes it has, again, like most things, consequences that sometimes comes and hurts us more than it helps us. But does anybody else have an opinion on this? I'm sure you do.
Who's going to make that judgment? Who's going to regulate this? The government? Private foundational money being spent? Who's going to judge whether it was good or it wasn't good? There has to be, it's like a court system. There has to be somebody who makes a value judgment about it. And I'm not quite sure I can see how that can be done. I have had a lot to do with philanthropy in my life, and I understand some of it. I just can't see where there's any possibility right now, scientifically, of any kind of measurement. And God forbid there should be government control of how foundations give out their money.
I'm too poor to answer these questions. So there.
Okay, finish.
That's honest. That's honest.
Alas, as we say here.
Anything else from anyone? Hi,
Sure.
Jack.
Hi. I have, hearing William mention the opposite, I was reminded of a comment made by John Galbraith, the economist. I can't remember, was he American or Canadian? I'm not sure. However, he said, under capitalism, man exploits man. Under communism, it's just the opposite.
Oh, that's wonderful.
I thought that was worth sharing.
Yes. Oh, anything else from, oh, thank you, Jack. Oh, I just love it when you guys are here. Anything else from anyone? Any feedback? I hope maybe you would like the opera series. I'm having great fun with it.
Looking forward to that very much.
Oh, thank you.
Absolutely.
All right. If there's anything else.
About Amazon was very interesting.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I find it very
Scary.
funny. Oh, don't be scared. At the end of the day, what do they want my money? They don't care about me. So yeah, that's the most that they're going to have from me. That's it. It's not that scary, It's like, you want to monitor me? You got nothing better to do? Be my guest. Have a go. Monitor whatever you like. What are you going to do? At the end, if you don't think I have enough money, you leave me alone. So I'm not really worried. Don't worry.
Well, Shoma, much better that they should sell people's DNA than selling people, as used to happen.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's true. That is true. Everything in
comment.
context. Well, thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you again for your time. Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you, Shoma.
Thank you.
Anytime.
Thank you.
Bye.
Me to do it.